right. Thanks everyone for joining. This is a brand new talk, so apologies if we bump around a bit, but feel free to interrupt if there's anything that's super unclear as I go. The first thing I wanted to cover was a few operating definitions around whole brain emulation. This is the hardest part I had when I was writing this talk, is how to talk about this. I actually want to break it into three versions: the weak, the moderate, and the strong. All of these are a bit overlapping, but roll with me. First, the strong version, the real deal. This is whole brain intelligence, consciousness, the whole bit, the things that we've mostly been talking about today. The resolution there is probably subneuron, and probably, like, as we're learning further and further down the rabbit hole, that we probably go. Many agents, ideally brains, that are on a shared substrate and can interact with one another. The moderate form, this is maybe something more akin to what we have today. There's anatomical or functional emulation at some level. Single neuron resolution seems to be feasible in near term, at least in some brains. So I put probably systems or maybe whole brain in small animals. Large animals maybe a bit harder, and humans, of course. But this is the one I'm actually going to spend the most time on, which is getting some aspect of whole brain functional emulation. And this is where BCIs really start to come in, and I'll start tying this back to the exact technologies I'm talking about. Today, we're talking about between 10 and a million channels of information. We're still many orders of magnitude away from the E to the 11 number of neurons that are in the brain.
That's what E11 means.
Yes. I actually didn't know that till the other day as well. But they cover the whole brain today, which is pretty cool. Now, the reason that I think this is kind of interesting is because depending on the use cases, different forms of WBE might be interesting to you. And in fact, I think all different forms of these can contribute to different types of AI alignment, potentially. Whereas longevity, for example, maybe is a little bit more limited. Okay, so let's get to the two different approaches. I think we can break these down by bottom-up and top-down. So the bottom-up being start at the kind of functional scale of the brain at neuron or subneuron level, and then scale that all the way up to the biggest version, which is ideally whole human brain. That's what we've been talking most about. But you can also go top-down. What can you get today, like Robert was telling us with functional MRI and other techniques where you can already see the whole brain, but can we actually start zooming that in to the level that would start to get us the level of detail, information content that actually resembles WBE? So starting with bottom-up, there's artificial neural networks, getting a bit further, connectomics and functional connectomics, and ideally in the future embodiment, many agents. And I just put in the matrix because that's always fun. Top-down, starting with whole brain imaging, this is what we have today, functional MRI. This is mostly acute, very limited settings, very short recordings, quite noisy. But in the future, moving towards whole brain imaging that's chronic, gives you access to, you see where I'm going? You get access to much more data, and ideally at much improved resolutions, both spatial and temporal. And eventually, hopefully, whole brain at single neuron resolution or better in vivo in humans. You are here. We are still quite far behind what you would actually need to call whole brain emulation from the top-down approach. But it does actually map over to this weak form really quite well. So all of these kind of top-down techniques with a couple of exceptions, there are crossovers, but mostly top-down contributes to weak forms of WBE, but those could be useful. Bottom-up is what's going to give you this strong. I like putting this in there. This is from your talk this morning. Ultrasound and neural dust don't work for strong WBE. I think for weak WBE, that might be a different story. And moreover, as you heard from Anders, there's a separation of scale. So I'm really glad that you guys brought both of those points up. Okay, so this is the whole map if we put it all together. I'm not going to have time to go into all of these, obviously, so I'm going to break it down. I'm just going to go into three and what BCI can effectively provide for this field. I'm going to start with whole brain single neuron recording, because this is what most of us are familiar with when we think of BCIs, and then I'll work backward from there. I was actually going to talk about artificial neural networks, but there's a couple people that have already presented on that, so you guys got that one. We're going to mark it green. Okay, so where are BCIs today? This is the version of neuroprosthetic BCIs that most people are familiar with. This is from our work at Caltech, my colleague Tyson Aflalo. One of his patients, Eric Sorto, who had a neck injury that paralyzed him from the neck down. 13 years later, he can use a neural interface to drink a beer on his own volition. So providing the ability to move back to people who have lost it, and there are many other disabilities that types of BCIs can actually contribute towards, which is an important point here because the medical field is a separate source of funding, but might also contribute to WBE in the long term. At AE Studio, we did a version of this that built on some work from Stanford that was actually using imagined handwriting. So the person imagining Handwriting, of course, unable to do that from being paralyzed. If you look at the spike rasters flowing by on the right, this is from a couple hundred channels worth of data with some fancy online techniques and newer machine learning models and everything that's coming out of LLMs. We can start to stream the text data just from this person imagining as if they were handwriting. And this actually approaches the same speed of an unimpaired person. But there's a problem with scalability. If you just look at the Neuralink implant, for example, it would take 6 Neuralink implants to cover just 1% of the human cortex. And that's just surface cortex. That doesn't include the sulcal folds. That doesn't include deep brain areas. So we are really, really, really far away. And in fact, if you look here, this is a plot from Stevenson and Cording, maybe the closest thing we have to a scaling law in BCI. The number of neurons that we can simultaneously record from electrodes. Doubling time is 7.5 years. At that level, if you look, starting from 1950, going from 10 to 100 to 1,000, takes us all the way to 2010. Getting 10 to the 11, E11, is going to be quite a ways away. We'll probably all be long gone before we get mouse brains. But we might be able to make jumps in that, you say. I think there's another problem, which is the butcher number. This was pioneered by Marcus Meister. It's the ratio of the number of neurons that you have to destroy to record from one neuron. Our Utah rays, like Eric has, kill 200 for every one they record from. And our best cases are recording or at the level of about 2.5. You need a butcher number of 0 to scale to the whole brain. And ideally, it's really close to 0, but ideally 0. All right, I'm going to go quick, sorry. So electrodes don't really work all that well. What about whole brain? Well, we've seen really fascinating examples from functional MRI, which can have up to about 100,000 channels or even 1 million in the near future. And just by looking at semantic maps or visual maps around the brain, actually reconstruct things that people are watching. You can do this with vision. You can also do this with language. There was a paper out just last week from Alexander Huth at UT Austin, reconstructing natural language from semantic maps that are spread widely through the brain. So my point there being that even though these are limited techniques, they do provide real value in the medium term. And then I think in the medium term going future from that, large scale, minimally invasive, long-lasting forms of effectively what would be implantable functional MRI is what I'm quite interested in. And we've been developing this using ultrasound. The physics of ultrasound give you access to nearly the entire brain. You can kind of see us pinging here and listening to backscattered echoes to listen in on the brain's activity, and you can actually modulate that activity as well. It is a huge technological challenge, which is much better than a physics challenge. This gives us wide field of view. It's longitudinal, and it's minimally invasive. I'll kind of skip forward since I'm out of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions about this at the end, enabled by some recent scientific advances. So I'm going to mark that one green as well. And if you'd like to see more on the neuroalignment workshop that Lisa and I held and some of these thoughts fleshed out a bit more, feel free to scan the QR code. But from there, I think I'll take questions.
Wonderful. We already have 2 minutes.
Just real fast.
And maybe we go with Micah after, just to also get some.
So real fast, megabits per second that you can get with the ultrasound thing?
In megabits per second, it's going to be super low because you're limited by the...
2.6.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure. We haven't done the information transfer rate of functional ultrasound. I think it's right now limited by the fact that we're using 2D slices. We're reliant on just using point-of-care ultrasound. So as we develop into our own version that's specific for neurotech, we're going to 3D. You're looking at probably 10 times what you get with functional MRI with a single implant, but we can start providing many.
But it's not a whole brain yet.
Not a whole brain yet, but within 5 years.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I think Michael, yeah.
Spatial resolution ultrasound, and also like how do you tell if a neuron's firing or not? It's like what's the contrast?
Yeah. So I skipped over that a little bit. The spatial resolution is diffraction limited to about half of the wavelength of the ultrasound that you use. To get whole brain in humans, that means you get to about 200 micron. That's voxel size. Now, you don't get single neuron activity with endogenous ultrasound. What you're looking at is neurovascular coupling effects, which is very similar to functional MRI, but down to the levels of the microvasculature, so your capillary beds and arterioles. We're tied to the activity of about 100 neurons rather than 1 million. So quite good. It's 800 times the volumetric resolution of fMRI. If you want single cell or cell type specific activity, then you can start using cell type reporters. So you're actually using sonogenetics, which is kind of similar to optogenetics, more nascent field, but evolving. That will actually start getting you down to your single cell level.
Okay, now I want your challenge.
Oh, you know what? I wrote it down because I knew I was going to forget. Hold on.
Is it one sentence?
It is one sentence. I want someone to convince me that neurotech can meaningfully contribute to alignment on AGI timelines, but specifically do so with an MVP set of tech specs. If you want the one sentence version, it's here. Sorry, I kind of elaborated.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sumner. This was great.